Hey everyone, Drew Reynolds here from Common Good Data. I want you to imagine for just a moment that you're trying to cross a bridge that is only built halfway. Now, I had this very vivid experience of this when I visited the Bridge of Avignon in France this past summer. A fantastic experience, but the famous bridge for the song Sur le Pont d'Avignon, for those of you who know the childhood song. Now, I realized as I was crossing this bridge, this very strange feeling of going halfway into a river and realizing you couldn't cross it. But it had so much relevance as a metaphor for the type of work that we do as social sector leaders, nonprofit leaders, trying to bring about change in our communities. Ultimately, the problem is that many of us are doing really important and meaningful work, and we have some of the pieces of the bridge that we need. But the problem is that bridge that gets us to that desired future of a strong organization that has consistent funding, that isn't constantly falling into this starvation cycle, as I often talk about, is that pieces of this bridge are missing. It's not the issue of your effort or your mission or the importance of your work. It's that the bridge between your work and the funding and the sustainability that you need for your organization is somewhat incomplete. Now, to address this challenge, I've introduced this thing called the CIF model, or the Clarity Impact Funding model. You can see it all over my website. But I want to talk a little bit about what that means. What are some of the pieces that are missing in that bridge that's incomplete, and then how your organization might be able to get there. So first, let's talk a little bit about the bridge. So the first part is this notion of clarity. So clarity is this idea of understanding what it is you do and why it matters. It's the strategic sort of muscle of your organization that has a very clear understanding about the type of change you desire to bring in the world and how you intend to document and measure that change. Having that clarity is so important. Without the clarity, you really can't move further across that bridge. If you don't really know exactly who you are and what you want to do, you're going to run into some challenges. So that's the biggest one, clarity. The second one is impact, which again then is the evidence that the work that you're doing is creating change. So what is all of the different types of evidence that you can gather? And again, we use that term evidence expansively to talk about quantitative, numerical data, as well as qualitative or more sort of stories and narrative based, and even things like testimonials or sort of other sort of anecdotal evidence from those you serve that you're having this important impact. We have this broad understanding of evidence that creates change. Your organization really wants to have that clearly understood. So you have evidence that the work that you are doing creates change. And that's something that goes beyond just a handful of stories in your organization, but is structured, is well put together, and is able to be credible to somebody who lies outside your organization. And then the last one is funding, which is the resources that sustain and scale your work. Now, one of the challenges that I notice is that funding is sometimes often seen as separate from your work of clarity and impact. You're thinking of funding as, oh, that's the development office's job or that's the grant writer's job. It's not really seen as woven into the very fabric of the work that you do as an organization. In particular, the programs and services that you offer. And that's one of the challenges, is that funding is not separate from clarity and impact. It's actually built right on top of them or alongside them, using this bridge metaphor that I'll be talking about throughout this episode. So the challenge is that most organizations, many of you have some aspect of clarity. You have a good sense of who you are. Maybe you have some good sense of why it matters. Maybe you could revisit it, but you have a decent sense of it. You're developing some evidence that your work creates change, but maybe you could improve it and have a little bit more. And the reality is that the funding is the challenge that we're experiencing right now because of the environment that the social sector is in. And we're trying to figure out how to improve all these three pieces so that we can build that complete bridge. The challenge is that right now most organizations, and maybe this is you if you're listening, are missing one of the planks of this important bridge. So let's talk a little bit about what some of those incomplete pieces of this broader bridge might be. First is this notion of clarity that is missing some core things. You might have a sense of maybe a clear mission. You might be doing lots of activities, programs, and services. You got a nice website that puts it all together. But you might be kind of a little bit in need of improvement in the areas of having clear outcomes, right? So for example, you might be able to say, well, we serve 500 people, but you're not able to necessarily show the change that came about as a result of that work. You might be able to say, we've delivered this many trainings and programs and services. We've administered this many funds in crisis assistance. We have put on an event that attracted all these amazing people. We've partnered with this many organizations. But again, the question we have to ask ourselves is what is the purpose of all that work? Right? What is the change that actually came about as a result of the work that you did? And if we can't answer that question clearly, ultimately we're missing a little bit of the work of clarity here. If we aren't entirely sure exactly how that change is coming about and how we're measuring it, we're missing an important piece. The other thing that comes up with clarity is that sometimes we are measuring things, but they might be the wrong things. So for example, if you're an organization that focuses on, let's say, youth development, one of the challenges is you say, well, we have youth, we want them to be leaders, we want them to be resilient, we want them to be managing challenges and difficulties and ACEs that they're experiencing. And you can list a whole list of dozens of outcomes and dozens of things that you want youth to be able to accomplish. But you're only meeting with them a couple times a week after school. Well, if that's the case, ultimately, how much impact you're going to have on those outcomes is going to be pretty limited. What you have to do in this clarity section is really get down and focus and say, what are the specific things we want youth to be able to do? Maybe by the end of this program, they're going to be able to apply for college. Maybe by the end of this program, they're going to be able to have demonstrated changes in attitudes and behaviors around substance use or mental health outcomes. Maybe we're going to see changes in academic skills, and we're going to develop increases in GPA. Getting more specific about exactly what you want to see happen and then building your programs to be aligned with that outcome is an incredibly important part of this clarity activity. And I encourage you to go back and think about it. You might think to yourself, oh, I got a good sense of this. I've got some of my outcomes. I want you to check it one more time. Go back and see, are the things that you're measuring really the thing that you're focusing on in the programs and services that you're developing? And if they're not, go back and see what needs to change, either the outcome that you're measuring or the data point that you're measuring or the services you're providing. So, second one, impact. One of the challenges I see lots of organizations have is that they have some data, right? They have some data about their programs or services. They might even have some strong outcome, but they don't necessarily have a sense of narrative or positioning about the impact that they're having. There's not necessarily a through line or a story, and there's not necessarily a clear understanding of what that outcome is and how the data that they're collecting is actually measuring it or putting it together. So, for example, you might say, we're providing all of these programs and services, and the outcome that you're working on isn't really moving, isn't really changing. Well, that's one of the challenges. Maybe you're not even measuring it, right? That's a problem. What you want to be able to do is to say, what is this key important outcome indicator that is important enough to the community, to your funders, to your stakeholders, and have you demonstrated impact over time that you're actually moving that outcome in some sort of meaningful or important way? Now, this can be really challenging for those of you who work on what we call a population level, when you're trying to bring change at the community level. So, for example, if you're trying to reduce violence in your community, if you're trying to reduce substance use in your community, if you're trying to reduce needs for crisis assistance in your community, any of those types of things, not all those things are in your control, right? So it's a little bit harder to be able to measure impact and be able to demonstrate it on that. So what you want to be looking at then is what are those types of important outcome indicators that you can control and that you are actually able to demonstrate some progress towards making a difference on those particular indicators, right? And a lot of times what that means is that you're tracking these sort of population level outcomes, but what you're really focusing on is the specific things that your program is actually doing, and then getting really clear about what that is and having the evidence to back it up. Now, in this project, I can't talk about impact without talking about the difference between outcomes and outputs and outcomes. And many organizations, as we kind of talked a little bit and alluded to in the clarity section, really are good at talking about what they do, but they aren't very good at talking about the result that it has. And so as you're thinking about building this bridge, right, you want to be able to be thinking about how can I find ways to better demonstrate outcomes that show meaningful impact and change. And if you can't do that right now, that's a place where you want to be focusing some of your attention in your organization. Now, the third sort of prong of this larger bridge, or I guess the pillar maybe of this bridge, is this notion around funding, where you might have a good sense of clarity, you might have a good sense of what your KPIs and outcome indicators are, and you might even be measuring it and have some evidence for it. The challenge is that the funding is still consistent because of the approach that you're taking to communicate that to others. And I can't tell you how many times I've worked with organizations where we do all this work to conduct some evaluation work, and then it gets into a PDF and sits there. Because inside that organization, there's a mentality that once the evaluation is complete and the report is done, our work is finished. And friends, that's not even half the battle. of what you're supposed to be doing when you gather all that information together, right? The last one is the hardest part to put it together, which is to take that information and that incredible clarity that you have as an organization and that impact that you're driving, and to be able to turn that into a value proposition that shows what you're doing in the community and then attracts like a magnet investors into your organization. So what are the symptoms of this? The symptoms are people who are doing reactive fundraising, where it's sort of like, oh shoot, we've got our grant, we're pretty content right now, things are fine. I'm not going to worry about it until that grant runs out. And then all of a sudden, the grant runs out and they're wondering why we don't have more funding in the pipeline. It's folks who are putting together proposals and grant opportunities and doing writing, trying to do all this fundraising work, but it's completely separated from your clarity impact piece. And so what you're writing about in your grant proposals or in a pitch that you're making to a fundraiser have nothing to do with your programs. And it shows, and you're not getting the funding that you need. Or maybe you're having difficulty connecting with funders because those funders are looking for things that maybe you're unable to provide or have access to. A lot of times this comes up with funders who are looking specifically for outcome indicators in the community that are relevant to their priority interests, and you're struggling to kind of make that connection between what they're looking for and what you're able to do. So the root of this issue is that we're putting together proposals and language and actions that are not really well aligned with funder priorities. We're not communicating that message in a way that resonates with what funders are looking for. And I'm speaking of funders broadly here, including both your federal and state grant organizations, as well as your community foundations or national foundations and things like that who are providing grant opportunities, as well as just local donors, individual donors and things like that. And the other issue that comes up with this is around this notion of backwards design, right? So in the case of clarity impact, we sometimes think, okay, we designed everything around this particular outcome indicator that we're trying to change, which is good. You have that backwards design. We identify an outcome that we want to change the community. We put together programs and services that are going to change that outcome. We deliver those, and then we measure the impact, and voila, we've got this great work done, right? The challenge is that sometimes that outcome indicator has nothing to do with what your key funders are interested in. And I'm not saying that you have to completely reorganize your organization to be aligned with funder interests. As an organization, you have to be true to yourself, who you are, and your mission. But if we're not thinking about how you're going to position the impact that you're making it as an organization to a funding source that would be likely to support your work moving forward, you're kind of missing a key opportunity here, a key part of your bridge to be able to build that sustainable organization that you so desperately need and desire. So the key here is to think also not just about who you are as an organization and your mission, not just the impact that you're creating and the evidence that you have that you're building success, but that you're able to align that to a list of key funders and supporters who are willing to support that type of change, who are going to look at the change you're making in the community and say, I want to be a part of that mission. And making that final connection is so, so important. Now, what I want to kind of talk about here was this larger bridge. And ultimately, what is this bridge to? What is it creating, right? I've alluded in this podcast that it's about the sustainable organization that you're trying to build. But I think a way to think about this is that if you have clarity and impact and funding, all these pieces together of the model in this bridge, right, that we've talked about in this bridge analogy, what you're going to ultimately be doing is building trust. That is ultimately what drives funding and support for your organization, is trust. And I was having a presentation the other day, and it kind of came up that we were like, what is it that people are asking when they say, hey, can you send me a report? Or I'd love to see some of the data that you have on this. Or do you have some evidence that you can share about the impact of your work? We kind of immediately think, okay, I got to find the data. I got to go into Excel somewhere. I got to put together these numbers, right? And yes, there's certainly some technical aspects to the work. But fundamentally, what's at the core of that question is not, do you have data? The core question that someone is asking you when they say, can you share more evidence about your work, is, can I trust you? That is the core question. Can I trust you? And if we start to think about evaluation work, this clarity impact funding model, et cetera, as an expression of an organization, an expression of trust, an arm reached out that says, hey, this is what we do, this is what we are about in our organization, and you can trust us that we're gonna do this work and that you can be a part of it, then all of a sudden the sort of keys to fundraising and grant success are unlocked. It's really that opportunity show that when you have these pieces in place, you have built a trustworthy organization that is worthy of the investment of others and the support of others to advance your mission. So trust is built when you have clarity, when somebody who's not in your mission, who doesn't see your work every day, can say, I clearly understand who you are and what you do. Trust is built when you have impact, when somebody can look at your work from the outside and say, okay, I actually believe what you're doing is working, right? As somebody who is not in your organization. And there's also a funding alignment. So there's somebody that says, I can actually see myself as having an important role in supporting this work. That's what you're trying to create here. And again, this is somebody who is not in your organization. And it's so hard to think about your organization, using that mirror as if you were somebody who's not in it, right? But this is, again, the bridge that you're building to somebody who's not in your organization. You're building this bridge to build this relationship with somebody else. The key here is that you're able to do it to somebody who doesn't know who you are and what you do. And it's much, much harder to do that because we're kind of sometimes stuck inside our own organization. We don't always, see what it's like from the outside. So again, this bridge is not just the structure that you're trying to put together. It's not just about an Excel sheet, a new survey, a new piece of evidence, a nice logic model, a wonderful funding package or grant application. What you're building is a bridge of trust between you and people outside your organization who are interested in supporting it. That's what you're doing. And if next time that you see a grant application or somebody asks you for some data or some evidence or some things about the nature of your work, I want you to think about it not as somebody is asking me for some technical piece or report or deliverable. What they're asking is, can I trust you? And to frame your response, how you write, how you prepare all of your materials with the understanding, the mindset of recognizing that this is a trust building activity. Now, how do you start to build this bridge, right? Well, there's a couple of actionable steps you can take. First is you want to diagnose where you're missing, what's not together, right? What are you unable to quite figure out? What are we missing on outcomes? Are we unclear on things? Or are we misaligned with some funders in some type of way? Do we have this core base of support that's been supporting our organization for a long time that really is desiring something different than what we're providing? Then you want to kind of align some of your work around a core narrative that really clearly explains who you are and what you do. That talks about that. What is the problem you're solving? What is the change that you're creating? What evidence do you have that supports that change is in fact actually happening as a result of your work? And to start to do a little bit of designing with the funder in mind. And again, as I said before, I don't want you to go out there and just be chasing money all over the place. That's an organization that lacks focus and lacks mission. But what you should be doing is understanding who are the core supporters and funders that are likely to support your work now and for the next 10 years plus into the future. And to align your work and your outcomes to meet the desires of that funder. Whether that's a program officer at a federal grant agency, whether that's a state or county representative, whether that is a community foundation or a United Way, whether that's a national foundation that you're working with, or maybe it's a core group of individual donors who've been supporting your work at your galas and your Giving Tuesday campaigns. Figure out what those funders are, what they want, and start to design your programs and evidence building and narrative and storytelling to meet that core desire and need, meet what that group of people is looking for. And it's likely that those groups are not necessarily all going to be thinking about it the same way. So you're going to have to be a little bit savvy and strategic about how you approach this, because not all funders are going to think the same thing or want the same thing. So you have to figure out how to find that Venn diagram of who you are and your mission and what you do, and where those funder organizations overlap to create that sense of synergy and impact, right? Now, what can you do to figure this out? Well, I have created a scorecard that I think is really, really powerful and helpful in helping organizations figure out how to answer some of these challenges and problems. There's the scorecard. I've got one for nonprofits, kind of generally speaking, as well as another one for behavioral health organizations. And you can find those on our website. I'm going to have them in the show notes for this episode, which you can find at commongooddata.com/podcast. Again, commongooddata.com/podcast. Or you can go to them directly, but you'll find them on the website. So check out these scorecards, because these scorecards do ask a series of questions. It takes you 5-10 minutes to just get a sense of which of these 3 areas you should be focusing your attention on first. And I'd like you to take it and reflect on it and to use it as a starting point. You can share it with others in your organization. You may find that others in the organization have a different opinion or maybe are seeing things slightly differently. And I think the conversation that comes out of that can be really, really powerful. So Have that conversation then with some of those folks as well in your organization, and use it as a starting point to have those conversations around clarity and impact and funding in your organization to figure out what your next step might be. So take that scorecard. And again, if you have questions coming out of it, or you want to talk to somebody about it, you can always reach out to me. Go to commongooddata.com/consult, and you can fill out kind of our information there, and I'd be happy to get in touch with you to work through some of the questions that maybe came up as you took this scorecard and how that can help improve your organization. So in closing, you don't need to be working harder. You don't need to be doing more. You don't need to be going to collect more data and a bunch of surveys. Maybe that'll be something that you do as a result of this work, but that's not the core focus here. The core focus is that you got to be thinking strategically about this bridge that builds trust between your organization and your desired future. This bridge between your organization and that group of core supporters and funders who are going to support your work, and to build these pillars of clarity and impact and funding to be able to have that strong, sustainable organization. And that they're all one system together. So I hope that this episode has been useful for you. Again, I'll have links to the scorecards that I just shared in this episode in the podcast notes. You can go to that at commongooddata.com/podcast and find those scorecards available there. I hope they're useful for you. Again, I hope that they're useful, and have a wonderful week and month as you're kind of working to continue to improve the impact of your organizations and secure the funding that you need. Have a good week.